So let's go ahead and start with our first presenter. It's Zdeněk Nebřenský from Prague. He'll be presenting a presentation on trade inspectors, which is something we actually was not discussing yet. And the subtitle is State Apparatus and Society and the Habsburg Monarchy. Off you go.
I slightly changed the title of my presentation because my empirical examples and evidences are from Bohemian lands. It means I will, after the introduction of general context, I will speak about Bohemian lands, and I shortened the period from 1884 to 1905. In my paper, second slide. In my paper, I will look at the history of trade inspectorate and trades inspectors in the Bohemian lands. I will follow recommendations of Gary B. Cohen. Cohen recommended in several his studies to study and to inquire public interest in some areas of government decision making, to inquire increasing involvement of the public in the functioning of the civil service, and to inquire possible cooperation of various interest groups with bureaucratic powers. In my paper, I will attempt to show the case of trade inspectors and how trade inspectors contributed to changes in the civil service, and how civil service took far greater account of the working and social condition of industrial workers. I will argue that these conditions of industrial workers were determined not only by businessmen, industrialists, managers, engineers, or even the impersonal demands of production. No less important role was played by civil servants, especially by the trade inspectors. Without activities of trade inspectors, industrialists and managers would not have adopted social measures on the large scale that they did. Several scholars have noted that in the Western context, the 80s marked efforts for the improvement of social and working conditions in industry. Civil service had become much more perceptive of the fact that industrial workers put their health and lives at risk. Such dismal perception contributed to the further expansion of social legislation and interventions of civil servants. The number of working hours was regulated, greater attention was paid to healthcare, preventing illness and injuries was emphasized. And I think this general statement is also true of the situation within the Habsburg monarchy. In the Habsburg monarchy, the trade inspectorate was introduced in 1883 after more than 2 decades of discussion within the government and parliamentary bodies. The introduction and proper scope of trade inspectors was inspired by the Belgian, German, and Swiss models. In 1884, the inspectorate had 9 officials. 1 year later, there were 12 persons. These 12 persons inspected nearly 500,000 enterprises and factories with 5 million employees over an area of 300,000 square kilometers. Within 30 years, the number of trade inspectors had multiplied tenfold, and the number of inspectors reached 126 persons in 1913. The main work of trade inspectors consisted of inspection trips. Inspectors spent 200 days a year on the road. It represented 2/3 of their working time. Trade inspectors had a duty to check compliance with the trade order and legal rules relating to the protection of workers' lives and health. In addition to occupational safety, working hours, wage rates, and vocational training, inspectors paid particular attention to where people worked and where people lived, where workers lived. The inspectors recommended the construction of sanitary facilities for workers. Industrialists consulted these inspectors when they planned renovation to factory buildings and construction of welfare amenities such as factory canteens, workers' houses, factory schools, and factory or industrial hospitals. Inspectors issued recommendations for specific renovation measures, and inspectors were also involved in approving plans and issuing permits. Inspectors were also involved with Crown land, district, and municipal authorities in issuing occupancy certificates of these buildings. An important stimulus for the work of trade inspectors was the International Sanitation Congress. One of these first congresses was held in 1887 in Vienna. At the Congress, factory hygiene, Fabrikshygiene, and the demography of the working population were discussed in different sections. The leading servants of the trade inspectorate attended these congresses, and these leaders of trade inspectorate would later instruct rank and file inspectors to check safety, health, and hygiene of factory workers much more carefully. Another stimulus was the Museum of Industry and Hygiene, the Gewerbehygienisches Museum in Vienna. The foundation of the museum was initiated by the Ministry of Trade in collaboration with the Trade Inspectorate in 1889. Within the museum's activities, inspectors and scholars educated factory workers about healthcare issues and promoted sanitary facilities. Inspectors, together with museum staff, also gave lectures and held exhibition about workplace hygiene in working class neighborhoods. 1889, the Trade Inspectorate asked the Association of Austrian Engineers and Architects to draw up a proposal for changes to factory building designs. These changes were meant to improve health and safety in factories. And after the proposal had been drafted, the inspectors debated this draft for several months. The inspectorate issued general guidelines for industrial facilities as well. And these guidelines recommended that sanitary facilities be established in factories in which dangerous and harmful materials were handled. Inspectors in individual districts followed the attention which the Ministry of Trade and the head of the Trade Inspectorate paid to sanitary conditions in factories. And I'm going to my empirical examples. First is from 1889, and this year Franz Klein, the inspector in Olmütz, appreciated during the final inspection process of Barn-out cotton mill that the industrialist owner of this mill in many regards respected the suggestions of the civil service and included modern sanitary facilities in the new building of the factory. In the reconstructed factory, functional ventilated toilet rooms for both sexes were created. In keeping with regulations, the toilets were built outside the hall of the factory hall, but this was a problem. To go to the toilets, workers had to pass through an open gallery, which means that they could catch a cold in winter. There were enormous differences between the temperature inside the factory and in the open gallery. The inspector recommended the industrialists to glass in the gallery so that workers were not exposed to extreme temperature changes on their way to the toilet. Very soon, inspectors became mediators between political authorities, industrialists, and workers. For example, in November 1888, a strike broke out at a cotton weaving mill in East Bohemian town Lanškroun-Letohrad. The district captaincy asked the trade inspector to try to settle the dispute. The inspector found that after reducing working hours to 11 hours, the company's management cancelled the workers' breaks for refreshments and food in the factory canteen. During his visit, the trade inspector was interested in the operation of the canteen. In his report for the provincial government in Prague, the inspector wrote, I quote, "Demoralizing is a sale of spirit by an industrialist. Ugly is a way of recovering spirit debts. The large gate is closed on payday. Workers have to go through canteen where they pay their debts, and at the same time, they are given the opportunity to leave part of their meager earnings there." Quote ends. The trade inspector, in accordance with the section 78 of the Imperial Code number 22, trade order, inspector requested that it prohibit the sale of spirit in the canteen. The mentioned law was an amendment to the trade order, which was approved by Parliament in February 1885 after several months of debates. The relevant paragraph 78 dealt with the payment of wages. Although the employer was obliged to pay the workers in cash, after mutual agreement, he could deduct accommodation, heating, medical care, food, or meals from workers on credit. For this reason, the payment of wages was prohibited in inns and tap rooms. Statthalterei in Prague extended this regulation to company canteens. The operation of company canteens was to be suspended half an hour before and 2 hours after the payment of wages. Let me present another example of how inspectors interacted with industrialists and workers. And it was example of weavers' strike at the mechanical weaving mill in the East Bohemian town of Náchod in the same year, in May 1888. The commissioner of the district captaincy wrote in his report that, I quote, "I pointed out to workers the criminality of their way of doing things. I promised them, in conjunction with the trade inspector, to get them what is decent and fair. However, because the factory owner did not want to make any concessions, workers said that they would wait until a trade inspector arrives in Náchod. The inspector finally arrived, mediating a settlement between the industrialists and the striking workers. Their wages were to be increased by 10% and compensation paid for the duration of the strike. The same day, the strike ended and the workers entered the factory in the afternoon. And my last example comes from the memoir of František Halas. František Halas was textile worker, and at the beginning of 20th century recalls how he got into an argument with the factory director. The director punished him by moving him to a workplace next to the toilets, and according to Halas, it was, I quote, the worst place in the entire factory. Besides the heat and the humidity, there was also an unbearable odor. I didn't say anything, wrote Halas, but I invited the trade inspector to have a look at my workplace. The director told inspector with a serious look on his face that for 15 years no one had complained about the smell, that I was the first one to say it stinks, wrote Halas. Nonetheless, the inspector ordered an immediate fix. Flowing water needed to be introduced into the waste trough. And now I'm going to conclusion. Based on the results of their activities, trade inspectors regularly published annual public reports. As they initially had very limited competencies, their reports were the only way to draw attention to the social and working conditions of workers. Through these reports, trade inspector influenced the civil service and the public. Due to the reports, discussions in newspapers about social, factory, and workers' conditions questions were raised. Also, due to the reports, district competency, provincial governorates, ministerial authorities, trade and administrative courts had to deal with disputes between industrialists and workers. Based on the reports, social liberal and conservative deputies of the Reichsrat drafted amendments to the Trade Order and to the Trade Inspection Act. In November 1905, the Trade Order was amended. The Ministry of Trade, together with the Ministry of Interior, issued a new decree. The new decree gave inspectors greater power to modify the workplace and surroundings. The inspectors could insist on the improvement of the factory hygienes and the construction of welfare amenities. The new decree was not only implemented in the main industrial centers. Trade inspectors, district governors, and municipal councils in factory villages also referred to its provisions. Inspectors insisted that industrialists ensure fresh air, heat, and light in factories, as well as provide kitchens, washrooms, toilets, or changing rooms to workers. And I will sum up my argument. The improvement of working and social conditions at the workplace and the creation of welfare facilities for workers has long been interpreted as a result of industrial paternalism. Industrialists attempted to rule over workers by providing them with such amenities. But I have attempted to demonstrate in this paper that the social and working conditions of industrial workers were not only influenced by industrialists, by managers, engineers, or by trade unionists. In the Habsburg monarchy, an important role was played by the civil service, which issued occupational health and safety regulations. These regulations influence the factory and working environment. Thank you for your attention. That's all from my part.